right, welcome. Today, we are diving into a really powerful passage from the Quran's second chapter, Al-Baqarah. It tackles this tough question. If God's word is perfect, why would it ever seem to change? And these verses, they get right into it. Divine law, faith, and that ultimate question of who is saved. The answers offered were, well, they were as challenging back then as they are thought-provoking for us today.
So, here's the game plan for our discussion. We're going to start with this idea of evolving divine laws. Then, we'll get a feel for the kind of challenges the very first believers were up against. From there, we're tackling the big one. Who gets into paradise? We'll also see how these verses were correcting some core beliefs floating around at the time, and we'll wrap up by looking at what they say about the prophet's real mission. Sound good? Let's jump in.
Okay, so let's kick things off with that central puzzle, the big question that hangs over all of this. If a holy book comes directly from God, from a perfect source, why would any of its laws need to change? I mean, it kind of feels like a contradiction, doesn't it? This was a huge point of debate at the time, and it really makes you think about what revelation even means in the first place.
What's fascinating is that the Quran doesn't dodge this question at all. It tackles it head-on. The core idea we're presented with is that divine guidance isn't some static, unchanging rulebook. Nope. It's actually something much more dynamic, something that can adapt. And to really get our heads around that, we need to understand a really key theological concept. And that concept is called naskh, which translates to abrogation. Now, this isn't about God making a mistake and then having to correct it. Not at all. The commentary frames it as an evolution of guidance. Think of it like a master teacher who gives their students different lessons as they grow and mature. The guidance isn't contradicted, it's just replaced with something better, or maybe something similar that's more fitting for where the community is at that very moment.
And the verse itself couldn't be clearer about this. It doesn't frame abrogation as a correction or a revision. Instead, it's presented as a powerful demonstration of God's complete authority and wisdom. It's like the ultimate authority saying, look, I know what is best for my creation at every single stage, and then providing exactly the right guidance for that specific time.
So, with that idea in place, let's zoom in on the real-world situation. The early Muslim community, you have to remember, wasn't formed in some kind of vacuum. As these verses show us, they were dealing with some pretty intense pressures, coming at them from the outside and from within.
The text actually highlights two specific kinds of challenges. On the outside, you had this pressure, this envy, from some members of established religious communities who really wanted to pull these new believers back into the fold. But there was also an internal risk, a danger of a community itself getting bogged down in endless, argumentative questions aimed at the prophet. Asking for signs and proofs, not because they were genuinely curious, but more as a way to challenge his authority. So with all this pressure, what was the divine counsel? How were they supposed to respond? What's so interesting is that the advice wasn't to fight fire with fire or to get into heated debates. The guidance was to build up their spiritual resilience, to forgive, to overlook the provocations, and to focus on strengthening the community from the inside through things like prayer and charity. It was really about trusting that God's plan would unfold in its own time.
And all of this leads us to one of the most profound questions in any faith, a question this passage faces head-on. Who gets into paradise? Who is ultimately saved?
See, at that time, salvation was often viewed through a very exclusive lens. Some Jewish groups were saying, nope, only Jews will enter paradise. And on the other hand, some Christian groups were making the exact same claim, but for Christians. This kind of thinking ties salvation not to what you do or what's in your heart, but simply to the group you belong to.
But then the Quran comes in and just cuts right through all those exclusive claims with this beautiful universal principle. The key takeaway here is that salvation isn't about the label you wear, it's about your inner state and your actions. As the verse puts it, anyone who submits their whole self to God and is a doer of good, they will find their reward. Suddenly, the focus shifts entirely from what tribe you're in to what you, personally, do with sincerity.
And let's linger on that phrase, a doer of good, because it's so important. The Arabic term is muhsin, and it goes so much deeper than just, doing a nice thing. The commentary explains it as acting with excellence, with this constant conscious awareness that God is present. It's all about the quality and the pure intention behind your actions. It's basically the peak of faith in practice.
Okay, so building on that universal idea of salvation, the verses then shift gears a bit. They start to address what the Quran considers to be some fundamental errors in theology that were common at the time.
One of the central beliefs the Quran speaks to directly is the claim that God has taken a son, This was, of course, a core belief for Christians, and the text offers a very direct theological response.
And the rebuttal in the verse is just immediate and absolute. It declares God exalted, which means he's far beyond any human-like need or characteristic. The logic presented is actually pretty straightforward. Since everything in the heavens and the earth already belongs to God and is obedient to him, the whole idea of needing a son or an heir, well, from this theological perspective, it just doesn't compute.
And this point is really driven home by emphasizing God's sheer creative power. The verse says that for God, creation is completely effortless. A simple command, be, and it is. So from this point of view, for a being that powerful and that self-sufficient, the concept of having a child is just entirely unnecessary.
The text then pivots to another major challenge the prophet was facing. You had people demanding more. They wanted to speak directly with God, or they were asking for these spectacular, on-demand miracles as proof, basically repeating some of the patterns of past communities.
And this brings us to our final section, which really zeroes in on the prophet's true mission. I mean, in the face of all these demands and pressures, what was his actual job, according to these verses?
The verses laid out with perfect clarity. The prophet's mission is defined by 3 specific roles. First, his job is to simply deliver the truth that he received. Second, to act as a bearer of good news for those who accept that truth. And third, to serve as a warner for those who don't.
And this verse right here is so crucial because it sets a really clear boundary on his mission. It states, point blank, that the prophet will not be held accountable for the choices other people make. His job is delivery. It is not forced conversion. The ultimate choice and the consequences of that choice rests with each and every individual.
So the ultimate message here, which is aimed at the prophet but really extends to all believers, is to hold on tight to the divine guidance you've received. The text warns not to cave in to the desires of other groups because their goal is simply to get you to follow their path. The commentary makes a really sharp distinction here. Once clear guidance has come, choosing another path isn't seen as following a different truth. It's just following human desire.
And all of this leaves us with a really powerful question to reflect on. These verses are constantly drawing this line in the sand between following God's guidance on one side and following human desires or group pressure on the other. So the question for us to think about is this: how does our own ability to tell the difference between a divine principle and our own wants, our own loyalties, how does that distinction truly shape our path to salvation? It's a question that's just as real and relevant today as it was 14 centuries ago.